The envelope felt heavier than it should have in Eleanor's trembling hands. Past due notices always did that to her, made everything feel like it weighed more than the world itself. She sat at her small kitchen table, the same one Edward and she had bought 32 years ago at a garage sale, and stared at the red letters stamped across the electric bill. Eleanor, we need to talk. She looked up to see Vanessa standing in the doorway, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the frame. Her daughter-in-law had this way of making even the simplest statement sound like a threat. Vanessa had moved into Eleanor's house after her son Daniel died 5 years ago, claiming she needed help with the mortgage. At the time, Eleanor had been so broken by grief that she would have agreed to anything if it meant keeping some connection to her boy. Of course, sweetheart, she said quickly, shuffling the bills into a neat pile. Would you like some coffee? Vanessa didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the counter and leaned against it, her arms crossed. She was beautiful in that sharp, calculated way that made people look twice. Blonde hair, always perfectly styled, clothes that probably cost more than Eleanor's monthly grocery budget. Daniel had been so proud when he married her, convinced he'd won some kind of prize. I've been thinking about our living situation, Vanessa said, her voice cold and businesslike. It's not working anymore. Eleanor's stomach dropped. What do you mean? I mean, Eleanor, that I can't keep carrying this household financially while you contribute nothing. The words hit like a slap. I pay what I can, my pension. Your pension barely covers your personal expenses, Vanessa interrupted. The mortgage, utilities, groceries, insurance. I've been handling everything for 5 years. I'm done. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with shame. Vanessa was right. Daniel's death had left her not just emotionally shattered, but financially vulnerable. The life insurance had barely covered the funeral costs, and her teacher's pension, while steady, was modest at best. What are you saying? She whispered. Vanessa pushed off the counter and moved closer, towering over Eleanor where she sat. I'm saying you need to start paying your fair share. Half of everything. Mortgage, utilities, groceries, insurance. That comes to about $1,800 a month. Eleanor almost laughed at the impossibility of it. Her entire pension was barely $1,100. Vanessa, you know I don't have that kind of money. Maybe we could work out a payment plan or... No, Vanessa said firmly. Either you figure out how to contribute properly or you'll need to find somewhere else to live. The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor stared at her, searching for any trace of the woman who had once called her mom, who had cried in her arms at Daniel's funeral, who had promised they'd take care of each other. You're kicking me out of my own house? It's not your house anymore, Eleanor. Daniel left everything to me, remember? I've been generous letting you stay this long, but my generosity has limits. Eleanor's hand shook as she reached for her coffee cup, needing something to hold on to. Daniel had changed his will after marrying Vanessa, putting everything in her name for tax purposes, he said. Eleanor had never questioned it. She'd never imagined she would outlive her own son. How long do I have? 2 weeks, Vanessa said coldly, turning to leave. 2 weeks to come up with the money or find alternative arrangements. And, Eleanor, don't think about calling my parents or Daniel's cousins. I've already spoken to them. They all agree. You need to learn to stand on your own 2 feet. After she left, Eleanor sat in her kitchen for what felt like hours, staring at the bills scattered across the table. At 58, she was too young for most senior living facilities, too old for many jobs, and too poor for almost everything else. The next morning, she found herself at the county employment office, sitting across from a cheerful young woman named Linda, who looked at her resume with barely concealed pity. Well, Mrs. Hale, with your background in education, we might be able to find you some tutoring opportunities, but the pay is quite limited. I need something that pays well, Eleanor interrupted. Something full-time. Linda's expression grew more concerned. At your age and without recent work experience outside of teaching, your options are somewhat restricted. That's when she mentioned the caregiving position. It's overnight work, she explained, caring for a gentleman who requires assistance due to mobility issues. The pay is actually quite good, enough to meet your needs, but it's demanding work. Are you comfortable with that type of care? Eleanor thought about Vanessa's ultimatum, about the possibility of losing the only home she'd known for decades, about becoming a burden on relatives who clearly didn't want her. Yes, she said firmly, I can do that. The agency sent her to a massive estate in the hills outside town. The house was like something from a magazine, all glass and steel and perfect landscaping. A housekeeper named Rosa met her at the door and explained her duties in broken English. Mr. Morris, he sleep very little. You stay with him at night, help him if he need anything. He is, how you say, not happy man since accident. Rosa led her through hallways lined with expensive art to a wing of the house that had clearly been converted for someone with disabilities. Everything was lower, wider, more accessible. He was in a terrible car accident 2 years ago, lost use of his legs, some of his memory too. Very sad. He has no family, no visitors, just doctors and nurses and staff. They stopped outside a heavy wooden door. He knows you are coming tonight. I warn you, he is not always friendly. The pain, it makes him angry sometimes. The first night was exactly as difficult as Rosa had warned. Mr. Morris, Edward, he'd told her curtly when she tried to address him formally, was demanding, dismissive, and clearly resentful, needing help. He was probably in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair and eyes that held a bitterness that seemed to go deeper than his physical injuries. But Eleanor needed this job, so she swallowed her pride, helped him when he asked, stayed quiet when he snapped at her, and tried not to take his anger personally. It was during her second night that everything changed. She was organizing his medications when he asked her to help him transfer from his wheelchair to the bed. As she positioned herself to assist him, he looked up at her with those bitter eyes, and she got her first clear look at his face in good light. The medication bottle slipped from her hands, clattering to the floor as her knees gave out beneath her. It couldn't be. It was impossible, but she would have known that face anywhere, even aged and hardened by pain and time. Edward, her Edward, the husband she had buried 30 years ago after a tragic car accident in Germany, was sitting right in front of her, and he had no idea who she was. "Are you having some kind of medical emergency?" Edward's voice cut through the ringing in Eleanor's ears. "Should I call for help?" She was on her knees on his bedroom floor, surrounded by scattered pill bottles, staring up at the face that had haunted her dreams for 3 decades. The face she'd kissed goodbye the morning he left for that business trip to Germany. The face she identified in a morgue photograph so badly damaged, she'd had to rely on dental records. I'm fine," she managed to whisper, scrambling to collect the medications. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the bottles. Edward watched her with a mixture of irritation and concern. "You don't look fine. You look like you've seen a ghost." If only he knew. She forced herself to breathe, to think rationally. This was impossible. Edward Hale had died in a car accident in Munich 30 years ago. She'd received the call from the embassy. She'd flown to Germany to identify the body. She'd buried him in Evergreen Cemetery, Plot 247, Section C. She'd visited his grave every month for decades. But the man sitting in the wheelchair in front of her had Edward's cleft chin, his distinctive nose that had been broken in high school football, the same scar through his left eyebrow from when he'd fallen off his bike as a child. Details that couldn't be coincidental. "I should go get Rosa," she said, standing on unsteady legs. "No," his voice was sharp. "Don't wake her over your clumsiness. Just help me get to bed and we'll pretend this didn't happen." As she assisted him with the transfer, she tried to study his face without being obvious. There were differences, of course. He was older, as they all were. The accident had left him with some facial scarring, and there was a hardness in his expression that the Edward she'd known had never possessed. But the fundamental bone structure, the way his ears sat against his head, the pattern of freckles on his forearms, it was all achingly familiar. "How long have you been paralyzed?" she asked as she helped him settle into bed. He gave her a sharp look. "Is that any of your business?" "I'm sorry. The agency didn't give me many details about your condition." Edward sighed, suddenly looking exhausted. 2 years. Car accident on the Pacific Coast Highway. Crushed 2 vertebrae, damaged my spinal cord. The doctors say I'm lucky to be alive. Eleanor's mind raced. 2 years ago would have been 2022. Edward had supposedly died in 1992. Where had he been for the 30 years in between? "Do you remember the accident clearly?" she pressed gently. "Not much. I was unconscious for 3 weeks. When I woke up, I had some memory issues." He studied her face. "Why are you asking so many questions? Are you some kind of reporter?" "No, of course not. I'm just making conversation." "Well, don't. I don't pay you to chat. I pay you to do your job quietly." She nodded and busied herself organizing his nightstand. But her mind was spinning. Memory issues. That could explain why he didn't recognize her, but it didn't explain how he was alive when she had buried him 30 years ago. Over the next few hours, as Edward slept fitfully, Eleanor found herself studying every detail of the room, looking for clues. There were no personal photographs, no mementos that might give insight into his life. The art on the walls was expensive, but impersonal. The books on his shelves were mostly business and finance texts. When dawn broke, Rosa arrived to take over the day shift. Eleanor was gathering her things when the housekeeper pulled her aside. "How was your first night with Mr. Morris?" It was educational," Eleanor said carefully. "Rosa, can I ask you something? How long have you worked for him?" "Almost 2 years, since just after his accident." "Why?" "Do you know anything about his life before the accident? Family? Friends?" Rosa shook her head. "He never talks about before. The lawyers who hired me, they said he has no family. Very sad to be so alone. Lawyers from big firm downtown. They handle all his business while he recovers. Mr. Morris, he was a very successful businessman before accident. They tell me he made a fortune in technology investments." Eleanor left the estate that morning with more questions than answers. Instead of going home to face Vanessa's cold stare, she drove to the public library and spent hours on the computer searching for any information about Edward Morris. What she found was bizarre. There were business articles dating back about 15 years, describing him as a self-made millionaire who'd built a tech consulting empire from nothing. But before that, nothing. It was as if Edward Morris had simply materialized into existence in his mid-40s with a fully formed business and no personal history. She searched for Edward Hale next, her husband's name. The obituary was there exactly as she remembered it. Survived by his loving wife Eleanor and son Daniel. Services held at St. Mary's Catholic Church. Burial at Evergreen Cemetery. But if the man in that wheelchair wasn't Edward Hale, why did he look exactly like him? And if he was Edward Hale, how had he become Morris? She drove to Evergreen Cemetery, something she hadn't done in months. The headstone was still there, weathered but readable. Edward James Hale, 1962 to 1992. Beloved husband and father. She knelt beside the grave, running her fingers over the carved letters. "Edward," she whispered, "if you're really in there, I'm losing my mind. But if you're not—" That evening, she returned to the estate with a plan. She needed to know the truth, but she had to be careful. If this really was Edward, something happened that he either couldn't remember or couldn't talk about. Pushing too hard might make him shut down completely. And she also needed this job. Vanessa's deadline was looming. And even if this man wasn't her husband, he was still her only hope of earning enough money to keep her home. "You're back," Edward said when she entered his room. He was sitting by the window, staring out at the gardens. "Did you think I wouldn't be?" "People don't usually last long working for me. I'm told I'm not particularly pleasant company." She studied his profile as he gazed out the window. "What do you remember about your life before the accident?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Fragments, business meetings, numbers, deals. Nothing personal." The doctor said traumatic brain injuries can affect autobiographical memory while leaving other functions intact. That must be terrifying. Not remembering who you were? "Sometimes I get flashes. A woman's laugh, the smell of coffee brewing, music that sounds familiar but I can't place, but nothing concrete. Nothing that helps me understand who I was before I became this." He gestured to his wheelchair. Eleanor's heart ached for him, whether he was her Edward or not. Maybe the memories will come back gradually. Maybe. Or maybe Edward Morris before the accident is all that's left. Eleanor moved closer to the window, standing beside his chair. "Do you ever feel like you've lost something important? Something you can't name, but you know it's missing?" He looked up at her, then really looked at her, and for a moment, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Recognition? Confusion? Pain? "Every day," he said quietly. "Every single day, I feel like there's a piece of me missing. Something that would make all of this make sense. Without thinking, she reached out and gently touched his shoulder. I'm sorry. That sounds like a very lonely way to live. He didn't pull away. Instead, he covered her hand with his own, and she felt the same electric connection she'd felt the first time Edward Hale had held her hand 40 years ago. It is lonely, he admitted, which is probably why I'm telling a complete stranger things I've never told my doctors. But she wasn't a stranger. She was the woman who had loved him, married him, lost him, and mourned him for 30 years. And now, impossibly, she was the woman who might get the chance to love him again, if only she could help him remember. Over the next 2 weeks, Eleanor developed a routine that felt both natural and heartbreaking. Each night she would arrive at the estate as the sun was setting, and Edward would be waiting in his study, usually reading or staring out at the gardens. He'd grown less hostile toward her, though he still maintained a careful distance. She started bringing small things with her, nothing obvious, just items that might trigger memories without seeming deliberate. A thermos of coffee brewed exactly the way Edward used to like it, strong with just a hint of cream. Classical music playing softly on her phone, the same pieces he used to hum while working in the garage. A crossword puzzle book because her Edward had been addicted to them. You don't have to entertain me, he said one evening as she set up the music. I'm perfectly capable of sitting in silence. I know you are, she replied, but I like music while I work, if that's okay with you. The piece playing was Pachelbel's Canon, the song they danced to at their wedding. She watched Edward's face carefully as the familiar melody filled the room. His expression grew distant, almost troubled. I know this song, he said slowly. Eleanor's heart jumped. It's a beautiful piece, very popular for weddings. Weddings? He repeated the word like he was testing how it felt in his mouth. I have this strange feeling when I hear it. Not quite a memory, but something close. She forced her voice to remain casual. What kind of feeling? Happiness and loss, like remembering a perfect day that ended badly. He looked up at her with those familiar green eyes. Does that make any sense? Perfect sense, she whispered. As the nights passed, she began sharing carefully edited stories from her own life. Stories that had once been their life together, but that she presented as her own experiences. She told him about the house she had lived in with her first husband, describing their little kitchen with the yellow walls and the herb garden by the back door. He sounds like he was a good man, your first husband, Edward said one night. He was. We were very young when we married, barely 22, but we were happy. She paused, watching his reaction. He used to say that the secret to a good marriage was making your spouse laugh at least once every day. Edward smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from him. That's not bad advice. What happened to him? The truth caught in her throat. He died in a car accident in Germany, while traveling for business. Edward went very still. Germany? Yes, Munich. I was supposed to go with him, but I was pregnant and the doctor said it wasn't safe to travel. She watched his face carefully. I've always wondered what would have happened if I'd insisted on going anyway. Maybe the accident wouldn't have happened. The accident might have killed you both, he said, quietly. Maybe. Or maybe having me there would have changed something. Maybe we would have left the hotel 5 minutes earlier or later. Maybe the accident never would have happened at all. Edward was staring at his hands, his brow furrowed in concentration. Munich, he repeated. There's something about that city. When you said the name, I felt, what did you feel? Terror. Absolute terror. Like something terrible happened there. He looked up at her. Do you think it's possible to have memories of things that happen to other people, or memories of places you've never been? She chose her words carefully. I think trauma can leave marks on us in ways we don't fully understand. Maybe you saw something on the news or heard a story that affected you deeply. But she knew it wasn't that simple. Edward was remembering his own death, or what should have been his death. Somehow, some way, her husband had survived that crash and lost 30 years of his life in the process. The breakthrough came during her 3rd week on the job. She was helping Edward with his evening medications when she hummed without thinking. A lullaby she used to sing to Daniel when he was small, the same one Edward used to hum when he was working on projects around the house. Edward's head snapped up. What was that song? I'm sorry, was I humming? I didn't realize. Sing it again, please. She hesitated, then sang the first few lines of the lullaby. Edward's eyes grew wide and his hands began to shake. I know that song, he said urgently. Not just know it, I can hear someone singing it. A woman's voice. She's... He pressed his palms against his temples. She's singing to a little boy. A baby. Eleanor's throat tightened. What else do you remember? Hands. Small hands touching my face. A laugh. A kitchen with yellow walls. He looked at her desperately. These aren't my memories, are they? They can't be. I don't have a child. She wanted to tell him everything in that moment. She wanted to show him the pictures in her wallet of Daniel as a baby, as a toddler, as a young man. She wanted to explain that those small hands had been Daniel's, that the laugh he remembered was hers, that the yellow kitchen was theirs. But instead, she said gently, memory is a strange thing after trauma. Maybe these are fragments of someone else's story that somehow got mixed up with yours. But Edward wasn't buying it. No, these feel too real, too personal. There's emotion attached to them. Love. Deep, overwhelming love. He grabbed her arm. Eleanor, I think I might have had a family before the accident. A wife, a child. What if they're out there somewhere not knowing I'm alive? The irony of his words struck Eleanor like a blade. His family was right there, had always been right there, taking care of him without him even knowing. Have you talked to your lawyers about this? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Maybe they could help you investigate. Edward shook his head. I've tried. They say there are no records of any family, no marriage certificate, no birth certificates for children. They insist Edward Morris has always been a bachelor. But you think Edward Morris isn't your real name? I'm starting to wonder, he admitted. These memories, they don't fit with the life everyone says I lived. The business success, the solitary lifestyle, the focus on money over relationships, the man in these fragments isn't like that at all. Eleanor stayed with him later than usual that night, sitting beside his bed as he struggled to piece together the puzzle of his identity. Several times he would start to say something, then stop himself, as if the words were just out of reach. There's something else, he finally said in the clearest voice she heard all evening. The woman singing the lullaby, I can see her face, not clearly, but enough to know she was beautiful. Brown hair, kind eyes, and I loved her. God, how I loved her! Eleanor had to look away before he could see the tears filling her eyes. She sounds wonderful, she managed. I keep thinking I'll see her again someday, his voice cracking, that she'll walk through a door and everything will make sense again. He laughed bitterly. Foolish, isn't it? Fantasizing about a woman who might not even exist. It's not foolish, she whispered. Hope never is. The next morning, as Eleanor prepared to leave, Edward called out to her, Eleanor, wait. She turned back to find him wheeling his chair toward her, a determined look in his eyes. I want to try something. It might sound crazy, but I need to know. What kind of something? She asked carefully. I want you to touch my face, he said, the way the woman in my memory did. Her breath caught. Edward, I don't think that's appropriate. I'm your caregiver. And please, he interrupted. I know it's strange, but something about you from the first night you were here, I felt like I should know you, like you're important somehow. With trembling hands, Eleanor reached up and gently cupped his face, her thumbs tracing the familiar contours of his cheekbones. His eyes fluttered closed, and she watched his breathing shift, deepen. My God, it's you! You're the woman in the memories! For a moment, hope blazed in Eleanor's chest, but then his eyes opened and confusion replaced recognition. But that's impossible, he continued. You're my caregiver. We just met 3 weeks ago. Unless, he paused, his voice hesitant, unless you're not who you say you are either. The walls she had carefully built around the truth were starting to crumble, and she wasn't sure what she was ready for when they fell completely. That day, she barely slept. His words echoed through her thoughts. Unless you're not who you say you are either. He was so close to the truth, and she was terrified of what would happen when he uncovered it. That evening, when she arrived at the estate, she found Edward in his study. But he wasn't alone. A man in an expensive suit sat across from him, a briefcase open between them. Eleanor, Edward said when he saw her. "This is Mr. Callahan, my attorney. I've asked him to do some research." Callahan stood and extended his hand. His grip was firm, controlled, intimidating. "Ms. Hale," he said, "Mr. Morris has questions about his past that we're hoping you might be able to help us with." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "I'm not sure how I could help. I only met Mr. Morris a few weeks ago." "That's what makes this so interesting." Callahan settled back in his chair. "We've been investigating Mr. Morris's resurfacing memories, and we've made some fascinating discoveries." Edward turned toward her, watching her intently. "Eleanor, what's your full name?" "Eleanor. Eleanor Hale." "And your first husband's name?" Her mouth dried. "Edward. Edward Hale." Callahan pulled a file from his briefcase and opened it. "Here's where things get complicated, Ms. Hale. We found records of Edward Hale, who died in Munich in 1992, survived by his wife, Eleanor, and son, Daniel. But we also found something else." He handed her a photograph. Eleanor's knees nearly buckled. It was a driver's license photo, clearly taken in the mid-1990s. The name read Edward Morris, but the face, unmistakably her husband's. Just a few years older than the man she had buried. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "From the California DMV. In 1993, 1 year after Edward Hale's reported death, a man named Edward Morris applied for a driver's license using a birth certificate that we now know was falsified." Edward stared at the photograph in horror. "That's me. But I don't remember taking this picture. I don't remember anything from the 90s. Eleanor sank into the nearest chair, the photograph trembling in her hands. "This is impossible." "Actually, it's quite possible," Callahan said. "Identity theft, witness protection, deliberate disappearance. There are many reasons someone might assume a new identity." Edward turned to her, voice raw. "But why? Why would I fake my own death? Why would I abandon my family?" Callahan looked directly at Eleanor. "That's what we were hoping Miss Hale could help us understand, since it appears her husband didn't actually die in that car accident." The room spun. All these weeks of cautiously managing the truth, and now it was exploding around her like shrapnel. "I need to explain," she said quietly. Edward wheeled closer to her. "Start from the beginning, and this time tell me everything." She took a deep breath. 30 years ago, you left for a business trip to Munich. 3 days later, I got a call from the State Department saying you'd been killed in a car accident. The body was badly damaged. I identified you through dental records and personal effects. "But it wasn't me," Edward whispered. "Apparently not." "You buried someone else," he said, eyes wide. "You mourned someone else." "And I raised our son alone," she said, her voice breaking, "believing his father was gone forever." Edward's face was pale, his breathing shallow. "Daniel, the little boy in my memories." Eleanor nodded through her tears. "He died 5 years ago. Cancer. He never knew you were alive." The silence that followed was thick with everything they had lost. Edward looked at her, pain etched in every line of his face. "You knew," he said finally. "That night, you knew who I was." "Yes." "And you said nothing?" "What was I supposed to say, Edward? You were dead. I buried you. I grieved you. I moved on because I had to. Then, suddenly, you were here, calling yourself by a different name, with no memory of me or Daniel or the life we had." Callahan cleared his throat gently. "If I may interrupt, there's more. We've traced Mr. Morris's financial history, the business empire, the investments. It all began with a significant cash deposit in 1994. Almost like someone starting over with a substantial nest egg." Edward rubbed his temples. "I don't understand any of this. If I'm really Edward Hale, why don't I remember? Why would I have left my family?" Eleanor looked at him, a thought rising for the first time. "Maybe you didn't leave voluntarily. Maybe something happened in Munich. Maybe someone forced you to disappear." "Or maybe," Edward said bitterly, "I was just a coward who wanted out of his responsibilities. No, she said firmly. The Edward I married would never have abandoned his family. Never. Which means something else happened, something that made you disappear and lose your memories. Callahan was already making notes. We'll need to investigate further. Look into what actually happened in Munich, who the real victim was, how Mr. Morris obtained his new identity. I don't want investigations, Edward said suddenly. I want to remember. I want to understand how I could have forgotten the most important things in my life. He turned back to Eleanor, something softer, deeper in his eyes. Tell me about our life together. All of it. Maybe if I hear our story, it will help bring back what I've lost. So she told him. Eleanor shared how they'd met in college, how she'd spilled coffee on his notebook and he'd smiled like it was the most charming thing that had ever happened to him, how they had their first kiss under the oak tree by the library, nervous and shy and filled with promise. She told him about their tiny wedding, just 12 guests in her parents' backyard, and the leaky apartment they moved into where he could never fix the dripping kitchen sink. She described the night their son Daniel was born, how Edward had cried when he first held him, how he hummed lullabies every night in the rocking chair, how he left little notes in his lunch bag when she was student teaching. She told him about his dreams of starting his own firm and the trip to Germany that was supposed to be the big break. You were everything to me, she finished softly. You and Daniel. When I lost you both, I thought my life was over. Edward had been silent through all of it, his eyes closed, brow furrowed, like he was willing the memories to surface. I can feel it, he whispered finally. Not clear memories, but emotions. Love. Such overwhelming love. And guilt. Terrible guilt. Guilt? I don't know why. But it's connected to why I left. I'm certain of that now. Callahan stood, closing his briefcase. I'll continue the investigation on my end. In the meantime, perhaps spending more time together will help recover more memories. After Callahan left, Edward and Eleanor sat together in silence. Then he said, I'm sorry. For what? For leaving you. For abandoning Daniel. For not being there when you needed me. Even if I don't remember why I did it, I know losing you must have destroyed you. Eleanor moved to kneel beside his wheelchair and took his hands in hers. You're here now. That's what matters. But am I? Am I really the man you married? Or just a stranger wearing his face? She looked into his eyes, searching past the years, the pain, the confusion, and into the man she had always loved. You're Edward, she said with absolute certainty. You're my Edward, and I'm going to help you remember everything we had together. He squeezed her hands tightly, and for the first time since she'd found him again, Eleanor saw something she hadn't dared to hope for. Hope in his eyes. Where do we start? We start by going home. The next evening, she arrived at the estate carrying a large cardboard box filled with photo albums and keepsakes she had stored away in her closet for decades. Her heart was lighter than it had been in years. Edward was her husband. He was alive. And slowly but surely, he was coming back to her. What she didn't expect was to find Vanessa sitting in Edward's study, her hands folded in her lap, her smile tight and dangerous. Hello, Eleanor, she said sweetly. Edward and I have been having the most interesting conversation. Edward's expression was guarded, confused. He looked between the two women as if trying to make sense of a riddle with missing pieces. Eleanor, he said slowly, your daughter-in-law has told me some disturbing things about your marriage to me, to Edward Hale. Eleanor's stomach clenched. What kind of things? Vanessa stood and walked forward slowly, as if savoring each step. I simply shared some family history I thought Edward should know about how unhappy you were in your marriage, how you used to complain that Edward was holding you back from your dreams. That's not true, Eleanor snapped. Isn't it? You told me yourself you only married Edward because you were pregnant, that if Daniel hadn't come along, you would have left him years earlier. Eleanor's face went pale. She had said something similar once, after Daniel's funeral, when grief had made her question everything. But it hadn't meant what Vanessa was suggesting. It had been pain talking, not regret. You're twisting my words. Am I? Because I also recall you saying how relieved you were when Edward died, that it freed you from a suffocating marriage. Edward turned to Eleanor, his face pale. Is this true? No, she cried. Vanessa, why are you doing this? But she knew why. Vanessa had figured it out. She realized that if Edward and Eleanor reunited, her grip on power would vanish. She had controlled Eleanor for years, but now she was afraid of losing everything. I'm doing this because I care, Vanessa said innocently. Eleanor's been through so much. I'm worried that seeing you is bringing back unhealthy feelings that she's projecting onto you. Projecting? Edward asked. I mean, Vanessa said gently, that Eleanor so desperately wants her dead husband back that she's convinced herself you're him. But Edward, you can't be expected to live up to the fantasy of a dead man. Eleanor stepped forward. He's not a fantasy. He's Edward, my husband. He remembered the lullaby, the kitchen, our faces. Suggestion, Vanessa interrupted. You've been feeding him memories. He's confused. You filled the gaps with fiction. Edward rubbed his temples. I don't know what to believe anymore. You should believe the evidence, Vanessa said calmly. And the evidence says you're Edward Morris, a successful businessman with no family. This fantasy Eleanor's created, it's not healthy. Panic surged in Eleanor's chest. Edward, look at me. Really look. You said touching my face brought memories, that you felt you knew me. I thought it did, he said uncertainly, but maybe I just wanted to believe there was something there. I think, Vanessa said with a syrupy tone, that it would be best if Eleanor took a step back, let you heal without the distraction of false memories. No, Eleanor stepped forward. I can prove who you are. I have our marriage certificate, our wedding photos, documents. Documents can be forged, Vanessa replied coolly. Photos can be doctored. Eleanor, grief makes people desperate. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. How long have you known? Known what? How long have you known Edward Morris is really Edward Hale? For a moment, Vanessa's mask slipped, and in that instant, Eleanor knew she had known all along. Vanessa's composure flickered, her lips tightening before she quickly regained her false sweetness. I don't know what you're implying, Eleanor. You've been watching me, Eleanor accused, stepping forward, following me. You showed up here at the exact moment Edward began to remember, armed with just the right lies to undermine everything. Edward looked between them, clearly rattled. Someone explain what's really going on here. Eleanor turned to him. Vanessa is afraid. As long as I was a poor widow who needed her charity, she had power over me. But if I reconcile with you, with my husband, she loses that control. That's ridiculous, Vanessa snapped, the warmth gone from her voice. I'm trying to protect you both from a harmful delusion. Are you? Eleanor challenged. Or are you trying to protect yourself from losing the house I've been helping pay for, the lifestyle my pension has supported all these years? Edward's eyes narrowed. What is she talking about? Don't listen to her, Vanessa interrupted. Eleanor's been confused since Daniel passed. She's projecting all her pain onto you. She even convinced herself you were Edward Hale. Eleanor stepped closer to Edward. Tell him about the ultimatum, Vanessa, about the $1,800 a month you demanded or I'd be evicted from my own house. That's not how it happened, Vanessa hissed, but her mask was crumbling. Is it true? Edward asked, his voice sharp now. Vanessa faltered. Margaret, Eleanor, has been having financial issues since Daniel died. I was helping her, giving her a place to live, but she became dependent, resentful. This fantasy about you being her husband is just her way of escaping that reality. Stop lying, Eleanor said. Tell him how you threatened to throw me out, how that threat forced me to take this job. That's why I'm here in the first place. Edward turned toward Vanessa, his voice firm. Is that true? She's confused, Vanessa said quickly. Grief affects people in different ways. Enough, Edward said. I want the truth, all of it. Fine, Vanessa snapped, her carefully curated facade breaking. You want the truth? Yes. She's been a burden. Since Daniel died, she's been moody and pathetic. I took her in out of pity, and she's been leeching off me ever since. I wanted her to start paying her way. What's so wrong with that? The silence that followed was damning. Edwards looked at her with new clarity. "I think you should leave, Vanessa." "You're making a mistake," she said through clenched teeth. "This woman is manipulating you." "Get out," he said. His tone left no room for argument. Vanessa spun on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The silence that followed was heavy. Edward turned to Eleanor slowly. "She was right about one thing," he said. Her heart clenched. "What?" "I don't remember everything. I don't remember our marriage. I don't remember Daniel. I have fragments, impressions, but nothing solid." He looked down, his voice full of anguish. "How can I be sure what I'm feeling isn't just desperation?" Eleanor stood and walked to the box she had brought earlier. She opened the photo album to the first page and sat beside him. "Look at this picture. Really look." It was a photo of the two of them cutting their wedding cake, laughing. Edward studied it for a long time. "We look happy." We were. We were so young and so sure that love could fix everything. She turned the page. "This is our honeymoon. It rained the whole week." Edward paused, staring at the photo of them under an umbrella. Wait. Something about rain, grilled cheese sandwiches. Her breath caught. "We were stuck in that cabin without power. You burned the first batch." His eyes widened. "And you laughed so hard you cried." Tears streamed down her cheeks. "You're remembering." He reached out and took her hand, his grip stronger than ever. "I'm trying. God help me, I'm trying." They spent the rest of the evening billing through albums and old letters. More memories came back, disconnected flashes at first, then full moments. Edward crying when Daniel took his first steps, reading stories in the living room, painting the nursery together. But Eleanor knew Vanessa wasn't finished, and she was right. The next morning, her phone rang at 6 a.m. It was Edward. "Eleanor, you need to get here now." Vanessa came back with lawyers. Eleanor raced to the estate. 3 black cars filled the driveway. Inside, Edward's study echoed with raised voices. Rosa met her at the door, visibly shaken. "Miss Eleanor, they say Mr. Morris is not who he says he is. They want to take him away." Eleanor's blood ran cold. She pushed into the study. Edward was surrounded by men in suits. Vanessa stood behind them, smug and triumphant. "Ah, Mrs. Hale, perfect timing. We were just explaining to Mr. Morris that there are serious concerns regarding his identity and mental competency." "What are you talking about?" Eleanor demanded. Vanessa stepped forward with a file. "After our conversation yesterday, I did some digging. I found some very interesting medical records." She opened the file dramatically. "It seems Mr. Morris was declared mentally incompetent by the state of California following his accident. His estate was to be managed by a court-appointed guardian." Edward paled. "That's not true. I manage my own finances." "Actually," another man said, "you don't. These gentlemen have been illegally controlling your assets. We represent the court-appointed guardian. We're here to take over Mr. Morris's care." Eleanor stood frozen, stunned. "This is insane. Edward is perfectly competent." "Is he?" Vanessa said, with false concern. "He told me himself he believes he's a man who died 30 years ago. That's a delusion." Edward looked panicked. "Eleanor, get Mr. Callahan, now." "They might not let me." "They will," Edward said firmly, "because I'm not going anywhere until my lawyer reviews everything they claim gives them power over me." What followed was chaos. Callahan arrived within an hour. He reviewed the so-called court documents and made a few calls. Within another hour, the truth unraveled. The guardian had been disbarred years ago. The lawyers weren't lawyers. They were actors hired by Vanessa. It had been an elaborate scheme to declare Edward unfit, seize his assets, and control his fortune. "You orchestrated all of this," Eleanor said as the real police cuffed Vanessa. "I was protecting him," she shrieked. "He's delusional. She manipulated him." But Edward and Eleanor both knew the truth. After the police cars disappeared down the drive, Edward sat in silence. "I'm sorry," he said at last. "I should have seen through her sooner." "You couldn't have," Eleanor replied. "She's had years to perfect her lies." "But something happened during all that," Edward said. His eyes locked with hers. "What do you mean?" "I remembered leaving for Germany. I remember Munich. And I remember the meeting. There were men there, dangerous men. I overheard something I shouldn't have. Something about corruption, money laundering, high-level crime." You leaned closer. What happened? They gave me a choice: disappear forever or risk you and Daniel's lives. I chose to vanish. They staged my death, paid me to disappear. I couldn't contact you. They were watching me for years. Tears spilled down her cheeks. You thought I abandoned you? Never, he whispered. Not for a second. I disappeared to protect you. The accident 2 years ago, when I lost my memory, that's when they finally stopped watching. That's why the memories are coming back now. I think my subconscious was trying to protect you, even when I didn't know why. Eleanor dropped to her knees beside him and took his hands. What does this mean now? Edward cupped her face. It means I'm done hiding. We've lost 30 years. I don't want to lose another day. He leaned forward and kissed her, gentle, deep, and full of everything they'd lost and found again. Will you marry me again? I want to do it right this time. Eleanor laughed through her tears. Yes, yes, of course. Yes, yes, of course I'll marry you again, Eleanor whispered, barely able to speak through the tears streaming down her face. Edward held her hands tightly, the deep grooves of age and time etched in their skin, but between them pulsed a warmth that felt as young and fresh as their first vows. 6 months later, they stood together once more in the same church where they had been married 40 years ago. The sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful halos around the few guests who filled the pews. Close friends who had known Eleanor for decades, a handful of neighbors who had remembered Edward from long ago, Mr. Callahan and his wife, and even Rosa, beaming with pride in a soft floral dress. The ceremony was simple, heartfelt. The absence of Daniel hung heavy in the room, but his presence was honored in every detail. A single white rose sat on the first pew where he would have sat, and Edward had insisted on including a passage in his vows that spoke directly to their son's memory. They had also established a scholarship in his name, the Daniel Hale Foundation, which would provide college funding to children who had lost a parent. It wasn't bringing him back, but it was a legacy he would have been proud of. As for Vanessa, she was serving a 5-year sentence for fraud, identity manipulation, and attempted kidnapping. The house that had once belonged to Daniel, the one Eleanor had struggled to keep, was now legally back in her name. Edward had insisted on that before they even began planning the wedding. It's yours, he'd told her. It always should have been. Do you, Edward, take Eleanor to be your lawfully wedded wife? The minister asked, his voice deep and warm. To have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for as long as you both shall live. Edward looked into Eleanor's eyes, his voice unwavering. I do, again and always. The crowd laughed softly through their tears, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Edward surprised everyone. With determination written across his face, he pushed himself upward from his wheelchair, legs trembling, muscles tight with strain. It was a move he and his physical therapist had been working on in secret for months. Slowly, shakily, he stood upright just long enough to wrap both arms around Eleanor and kiss her like he had 40 years ago. She was crying openly, laughing through it. When he sat back down, breathless but triumphant, she whispered, You planned that? Every second. I wanted to stand when I promised myself to you again. That evening they returned not to the grand estate with its cold marble floors and glass walls, but to a cozy single-story house they had bought together just outside the city. It had wide doorways for Edward's chair, a small herb garden Eleanor had already started planting, and yellow paint in the kitchen to match the one they had once called home. They sat on the terrace as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky painted in strokes of pink, orange, and gold. A gentle breeze carried the scent of rosemary and jasmine through the air, and Edward reached out to hold Eleanor's hand. Do you ever think about what life would have been like if I'd never gone to Germany? If we'd just lived out our days in that little house, raising Daniel, getting older the normal way? Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, her voice soft. Sometimes. But then I think maybe we needed to lose each other to understand what we had. Maybe the pain, the loss, maybe it all taught us to value every second we get now. Edward turned his head slightly to kiss her temple. You're right. I don't want to waste another moment. From somewhere in the distance, a woman's voice could be heard humming a lullaby. The same one that Eleanor had sung to Daniel, the one that had sparked Edward's first real memory. He smiled. I remember that song. Eleanor smiled too. Hold on to it. Hold on to all of them. The The stars began to appear, one by one, as the darkness wrapped around their little home. They sat in silence, hand in hand, two souls who had found each other again after 30 years lost, and this time they weren't going to let go. Life wouldn't be perfect. Edward's memories were still patchy, and Eleanor carried the scars of grief that would never fully heal, but they were together. They were whole in a way neither had thought possible again. As the night deepened, Edward whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me. I never could. Even when I thought you were gone forever, you were still part of me." And as they watched the moon rise over the hills, Eleanor thought about all they had endured: lies, heartbreak, betrayal, and loss, but also all they had reclaimed: love, truth, a second chance. She gently squeezed Edward's hand. "Now," she said, her voice steady and calm, "I think it's time to share our story." Edward glanced at her, puzzled. "With who?" "Everyone," she said, gesturing to the phone she had placed on the table, already recording. "Our story is too unbelievable not to tell, and maybe, just maybe, it'll help someone else hold on a little longer." She turned to the camera with a soft smile. "Now that you've heard everything, I want to know, what would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever lived through something that made you question everything you thought you knew? Comment below and tell me where you're watching from so I can see just how far this story has reached." The screen faded to black, and as Eleanor uploaded their story, now immortalized in pixels and sound, she felt a quiet peace settle over her. It wasn't just about telling the world, it was about reclaiming her voice, her truth, and the love that had somehow found its way home.